Welcome to the UNC Pembroke School of Business Distinguished Speaker Series. Thanks for coming out this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today. Dr. Russ McCullough is the Wayne, I guess it's Angell?
Angell.
The Wayne Angell Distinguished Chair of Economics at Ottawa University, which is in Kansas, darn it. It's not in Canada. And he's also the founder and director of the Gortney Institute. And I went online today, and I actually saw some of this, but I was kind of struck by the message. And it says the Institute is committed to fostering a discussion of public and private solutions to poverty, how technology innovation will impact society, and the overlap of markets, governance, faith, and philosophy. Dr. McCullough earned his Bachelor of Arts in Economics from St. Cloud University, State University in Minnesota, and his PhD from Iowa State University. He's taught economics classes, many economics classes over the last 20 years. But I think one of the things, he's a self-described serial entrepreneur. And he started and owned and operated businesses as diverse as real estate development, a restaurant in there in one part, and also a construction company. He's an excellent public speaker, sought after, and it's my pleasure to welcome him to UNC Pembroke this afternoon. Dr. McCullough.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction. Yes, so if you hear me hang on to my O's, that's from my Minnesota days. So that still lingers, even though I haven't been there for a long time. So yes, it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you to Cliff for setting things up, and I'm happy to come and speak what I call the good word of economics. And so I'm excited to hopefully deliver you some things to think about that maybe you haven't before. So at the Gortney Institute, one of our mantras is that we kind of think poverty sucks. Does anybody agree with that? Yeah. You guys like poverty around here? Okay, so our Twitter handle there is @123povertysucks. And if you happen to pull out your phone and put hashtag GI Pembroke, maybe take a selfie or something, or while you're taking it and put that hashtag if you're a Twitter person, that would be great. So we publish on that as well as on our website. We've got some other fun stuff that we do. And one of the things that we've been doing the last year, we're about on our 1-year anniversary of our podcast. It's called Faith in Economics. Sometimes it's more faith-oriented, sometimes it's more economics-oriented, but all kinds of topics, and that comes out every Monday. So if you happen to listen to the podcast and like some of what you hear today, you can check that out. All right, so I named the Gortney Institute after Jim Gortney, who's still a professor at Florida State University. And he was the one that came up with this Economic Freedom Index. And it's a single number that kind of shows how easy it is to do business around the world. And so he's fairly famous for that work. And so today's presentation is going to kind of bring together some of those elements on what does it mean to have economic freedom and why should I care about it. So, anybody recognize that little island-ish nation there? So we got North and South Korea. What's the distinguishing factor here of this night shot? What's North Korea? Difference between North Korea and South Korea. This is a picture in the evening. The lights, yes. So there's not a lot of economic activity going up in North Korea. So we're going to explore, the way governments are set up and the way people operate to see what we can do. Before we do that, though, it's important that we have a really solid foundation to rest some of these thoughts on. And so, have any of you seen the movie Castaway? Old movie, Tom Hanks washes up on the island, right? So I want you to imagine that we've got Tom Hanks here on an island, and we're trying to think about what really makes an economy. And so Jen later, this isn't in the movie, but Jen washes up on the island too. And so each person is confronted, kind of jumped the gun there. Each person's confronted with different options. Harvesting coconuts or going fishing. And so one option for Tom is to do 8 coconuts and 8 fish. And one option for him is to do 4 coconuts and 12 fish, right? So what should I do today? Should I do coconuts or fish? Jen, on the other hand, could do 4 and 8 or 3 and 11, right? So everybody has different skills and can do different things in the day. So by looking at those numbers, what can you tell me about these 2 individuals? If you look carefully at kind of option A, option B, who's better at stuff? Yeah. Yeah, his efficiency's higher, right? So he's actually more productive at both. It's kind of, Tom's one of those guys that's just good at everything, right? He can sing, he can dance, he's good at sports. It's like, what can't this guy do, right? So he has what economists call an absolute advantage in production. He's good at everything. And so the question I pose to you then, and this is what David Ricardo posed to the King of England years ago, is, I know you're better at everything, O King of England, but please trade with France. Here's why. So we're going to build some arguments as to why a guy like Tom might still want to engage in trade. If we look at those numbers, he has a 1-to-1 trade-off of fish and coconuts. So if we look at point A, where he's at 8 and 8, if he gives up 4 coconuts, he can get 4 fish, right? So in a sense, that's his internal trade-off of a 1-for-1, and so the cost of a fish is a coconut, the cost of a coconut's a fish for Tom. For Jen, if we look at her trade-offs on a given day, she's got 1 for 3, right? So if you think about that chart again, in the trade-offs, 1 coconut can get Jen 3 fish. So if that's true, in that sense, who's the better fisherman? Jen, right? So check it out. So remember, Tom was 1-for-1. 1 fish would cost 1 coconut, but for Jen to go fishing, it's only 1/3 of a coconut, right? So Jen has what we call a comparative advantage. And I hope that you guys are gaining a comparative advantage in something here at UNC during your time here. That's what you're trying to do. How many of you want to get jobs when you get out of here? Right? How many of you want to like your job when you get out of here? Okay, so hopefully you're developing, you're finding out kind of what you're good at, being more productive at something, or having a less cost method is kind of a nice way to do that. So if we plot out these 2 points for each person, we can look at their possibilities in total and draw a line if we specialize in what we're good at. So what we're going to do is say, hey Jen, why don't you go fishing, and Tom, you go do the coconuts, and let's see what we can do on the island, right? So if they fully specialize in what they're good at, we get this kind of interesting picture. And the kinky one on the outside is that, and I'm a little bit off the screen over here, but the kinky one on the outside is the world production of coconuts and fish. Of course, our world is just this little island with 2 people, right? So if both Tom and Jen go fishing, the world can have 36 fish if you look over here at this side, right? And so that's the total amount of fish that would be possible. Now, if we want some coconut milk to wash down our fish, who should we send out for the first coconut, Tom or Jen? If we're at this point over here, where we have all fish, 0 coconuts, who would be the best person to send out to go get a coconut? Tom, right? Why? Because for Tom, he can go get 1 coconut and only give up 1 fish, whereas Jen would have to give up 3, right? So this orange line here represents what we'd want to do for the world, which is actually Tom's production possibilities there, right? So the orange line is kind of color-coded. Now if we move all the way up to point XC, we very well might want more coconuts, but Tom's spent, right? He's done. And so the only way we get more coconuts now is to send Jen out. So Jen is that blue line. If we were at point XC and wanted to continue to get coconuts, now it's going to be at a rate of 3 fish for every coconut. All right, so why is this important? Well, I also put in here XA and XB. And all I did is I took the two combinations of A and B that we started with, and I added up their totals. So in other words, if each person was doing a little bit of both, it would be XA and XB. What's significant about XA versus XC? XA versus XC. Which one would you prefer to be in? XC, because you like more chicken wings and beer as opposed to less chicken wings and beer, right? More coconuts and fish rather than less coconuts and fish. So clearly XC, from society's standpoint, is superior to XA. Okay, so that is a production possibilities, and if the only way we can get there then is to fully utilize all of our resources to get up to that point. Okay, so let's say we're at that point. Tom is sitting with 16 coconuts. Remember, he had all the coconuts, and Jen does all the fish. If Tom says, how about 2 fish per coconut? Is that a good deal for Jen? Is she getting screwed or not? 2 fish. So Tom says, how about 2 fish for a coconut? So remember, Jen's sitting over here with 20 fish. If she wants to do it herself, what would it cost her to get a coconut? 3. So is 2 a good deal? Yeah. Okay, so Jen's making out like a bandit. Tom's getting screwed. Right? Somebody has to win and somebody has to lose, right? So is this a good deal for Tom? Tom's got 16 coconuts. If he was to go and do it himself, how many would he get if he gave up a coconut? 1. Remember, Tom, if he's doing it by himself, has a 1-for-1 trade-off. So wait a second. Both people win? A win-win situation? I thought when I go to Walmart and I pay my money to Walmart, Walmart wins and I lose when I go buy something at Walmart. Isn't that the case? That the profit-making company makes a profit and we lose? If I go and buy a bag of Doritos for $2.25, what is the value of that bag of Doritos to me? If I go to Walmart, buy a bag of Doritos for $2.25, what is the value of that bag of Doritos to me? More good. Who said that? Way back. Gosh, if you weren't so far back, I was going to throw you a T-shirt, but I can't throw it that far. So that is $2.25 is what I paid, but I very well might have paid $4 for it, right? And so did I profit off of Walmart? In a sense, right? I paid $2.25 and I'm up $1.75. Now, did Walmart probably profit off the Doritos? Yes. Day in and day out in the market system, voluntary trade between people creates win-win situations in the market. And that's what we're seeing here between Tom and Jen, a win-win situation at this 2-to-1 offer. So maybe she takes it. So if we now look at the possibilities for consumption and not just production. When Tom lived on the island by himself, what he produces is what he consumes, right? But now, if we open up the idea of trade here between the two people, what's kind of exciting, gets me excited, I hope it gets you excited a little bit, is I look at Jen sitting here with 20 fish, and as soon as she gives up a fish on that 1-for-2 deal that Tom did, we start to follow the green line, right? So I give up 1, I get 2. All of a sudden, I'm outside of everywhere I could be by myself. I am consuming at points outside of what I could do. The same is true for Tom. Tom's production possibilities are right there, and as soon as Tom starts trading with Jen, he starts following that consumption possibilities line there. And so that is the miracle that goes on that we take for granted day in and day out in the marketplace. It's a bunch of win-win, wealth-creating, income-generating trades that help to make people better off than if they were operating in isolation. and that's the market. Okay, so I need to have that kind of, can I just get like a yay, or maybe a clap? How about a clap? Wait a minute. Oh, love it. Yeah, yay, love it. Okay, so this is information that a lot of people don't get, right? This is just a simple, what economists call, if you, those of you who had an economics class might remember, the principle of comparative advantage. And so how does that little island model scale up in the United States? How many of you watch Shark Tank? Any Shark Tank watchers? I like Shark Tank. My son and I used to watch it. So, Kevin O'Leary would say, oh, how's this going to scale up? Like, oh, you got this great little island example, but, how does this work in the real world? So we got 300 million people on our island now. There's been a little busy work between Tom and Jen over some period of time. And the scaling up is here with the households. That's who we care about in society. And then for 8 hours a day, approximately half of those people is the labor force in the United States. Approximately half of those people put on a different hat. And they go work their comparative advantage with other people, usually in a firm. Could be in some other nonprofit or maybe a government agency. But in the private sector, this is how it would scale up. Most people are working for a private business or a company and then go back over there. And so that's how this thing scales up. You guys, we continue to get more and more specialized compared to when the United States started 250 years ago, where we were more rural agriculture. You pretty much produced, and that's what you consumed. But as we started to specialize and followed Adam Smith's advice, we started to be able to scale up and sell off our surplus, just like Tom and Jen did on the island. Okay, so now we're ready to talk about economic freedom. So how does this work in the big grand scheme of things? So this is Jim Gwartney's definition that's in every book. This gets published annually. So we've got economic freedom if we can kind of do what we want with property that we own. It's kind of that simple. There's some sort of infrastructure, government, if you will, some rules that say you have the right to property. Those rights aren't quite as large if you're in a communist country as opposed to a more market-oriented country, right? So having private property is one ingredient, but not all the ingredients needed for economic freedom. So how do we get a high amount of economic freedom? If government spending and taxes are low, that's more money in your pocket, right? So if you think about your paycheck of $1,000, how much of that is going to government? In some countries, maybe 40% is going to the government. You have $600 to go live your life with, or to invest in a company, or to do whatever you do with your leftover money. And then $400 of it is used by the government for some other purpose. So if we're thinking about economic freedom for the individual, then the lower the tax rate is, if the tax rate's only 20%, now you have $800 instead of $600 to do with what you choose, right? So in terms of thinking about economic freedom for an individual, less government spending, less taxes is going to be create more freedom for the individual. Now, sound money, how does the money supply work in the United States? We have a pretty good system, actually. It's pretty stable. Cliff is from Ghana, where it's not so stable. Sometimes governments like to, they run out of money, and instead of raising taxes, they just run the printing press, and that turns out to be a bad idea that we won't spend too much time on. But we're pretty good with the money. Protecting property rights. So how is the court system? How is the police system? So you guys have heard of corruption in other countries. That's something that needs to be taken into account. And trade barriers, are you able to trade with the rest of the world? Do you have a president who's jacking up tariffs with China? Do we have that ever going on? Yeah, if you guys pay attention to the news, right? So that's creating a barrier to trade, raising the price of goods for Americans of Chinese-made products. So that ends up being something that's going to restrict your freedom to buy a cheaper Chinese good, for instance, as opposed to a more expensive domestic good. And then finally, regulations. So in the labor market especially, is there minimum wage, is there work requirements, all the different types of regulations that companies need to face. What do those look like? Do we have a lot of freedom to do stuff or not? So, what Jim's group has done is analyzed 162 countries are now included in this. And there's 42 variables in 5 areas. And so what's kind of neat about this index is it's just a simple average of some external data that has come in. So they might go out to different countries and say, hey, how easy is it for you to do business on a scale of 0 to 10? Right? And they do that, so there's the World Bank and other international agencies that collect data on how easy it is to do business and these other factors. And so all of that information then is compiled, boiled down to a simple single number that then shows how easy it is to do business is the objective. So those 5 areas are the ones we kind of ran through in that paragraph. Size of government, legal system and protection of property rights, money, freedom to trade internationally, and then the regulations. Every country then that has data, by the way, North Korea we don't have good data on because the leader of that country there doesn't want to share their data very much. And so some other countries sometimes have suspect data, but the ones that we can have reliable data for get coded, and that's what the world looks like in terms of the freedom people have to do the things that we've been mentioning with economic freedom. So most free is the blue, down to the least free is the red. And so you can see the southern hemisphere here has some red to it, right? So that's where we hear, I hope you guys have learned a little bit about the plight of Venezuela. I mean, it is right now a poster child for how awful things can get when we don't have economic freedom in place. So they are at the very bottom on the economic freedom, as we'll see in another slide. Large portions of Africa are missing out on some economic freedom and frankly missing out on income that maybe could be done for saving lives and other things. So here's the top 10. So this just came out in November, so this is kind of hot off the press. Notice that it says 2017. It does take a couple of years to get all the data in place. So we're in November of 2019, and this is using 2017 data. Hong Kong's been in the #1 position for a long time, but Hong Kong's been in the headlines, right? So there are freedom fighters. Those are the protesters. How many of you have heard of protests going on in Hong Kong? Right? So that's a big deal, and that is really about freedom. I don't want to get sidetracked too much, but basically, a small faction of people wanted to extradite people to mainland China to be processed for crimes. And they said, no way, we want our freedom. And Hong Kong's been one of the most free, it's technically not a country per se, but when the Brits let go of it in the 50s, it was set up with a really strong rule of law, and that's part of why it enjoys a great deal of economic freedom. Proud to see the United States coming in here. The United States had drifted as far down as 18 in the rankings at one point, and so it's kind of made a comeback. Canada, Australia, United Kingdom. So here gives you a little feel for some other nations. So Denmark, Finland, one of the maybe not so secret things, but some of the Democratic Socialists, Bernie Sanders, and they kind of point to the Denmark-Finland model as that's the way the United States should go. And they do have a great deal more of government spending, but if you really look, it's all more of a market-based economy. In a lot of areas, they're more free than the United States. So that's really from market-based principles that they have enjoyed some of the prosperity that they have. So we have our more socialist friends here over in Italy and France as we start to move down. And then we've got India, who's climbed the ladder quite a bit with President Modi has made a lot of changes, more market-based changes. They were 113th even last year, which is where China is. So all of this is color-coded into quartiles. So the blue is the top 25%, and then these are the middle 25%, and then the red, which I'm going to show here in a second, is the bottom least free countries. So here, that thing goes crazy. You guys are getting a little sneak peek at all the fun stuff here. Oh, there it is. So Iraq, Congo, Congo, Egypt, all the way down to Venezuela, these are the countries that have the least amount of economic freedom. And so, why is this economic freedom, important? Is what these next things are going to get in. So, we have a lot of great information about how this affects poverty and income, life expectancy, and what's happening with income inequality? Have you guys heard about that being an issue? Income inequality, so the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. You heard stories like that? So what's kind of interesting is that's not true around the globe. And the reason is based on economic freedom for the most part, that countries who have embraced more freedom policies have seen growth rates in income that exceed the growth rates of some of the bigger industrialized countries. And so here's the information kind of showing how the gap between the countries is lowering. Freedom in general, those 5 areas, is going up. So that's good. The world is becoming more free, is what this is showing, all the way back from 1980 through today. So, Soviet Union, you guys remember those guys? Putin's kind of in the limelight now, but back in the day, the Soviet Union tried to take over a bunch of other countries. Anybody know what date that fell when the communist Soviet Union broke up? Anybody a history buff in here? 1989, you're close. Wait, who said that? So yes, you're pretty close. So in that time frame, that's when it kind of started. So 91, they kind of officially got changed. And so if we look at how they changed it, created what economists call a natural experiment. Right? So that was kind of a big deal. Communist regime, everybody's treated the same. And then boom, go figure out your own deal. Some of those countries embraced market principles. I had the opportunity 2 summers ago to go to Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. So those are right along the Baltic Sea. And those 3 countries are ranked in the top 25%. And this bottom blue line here shows that from 1995, shortly after the reorganization, those countries are growing at 4.5%, whereas countries who kind of kept the Soviet-style system of a larger government, more top-down control, they're growing at a slower rate at 3.3. And so all of this starts to kind of point some evidence that, maybe there's something to this economic growth stuff. So here's the data. Least free to most free. How many of you like money? Okay, good. I'm glad to see a lot of hands there. It must be a good business department that's going on here, that we got at least people thinking about money. I mean, hopefully we have an appreciation of the opportunities that can create. So in the most free countries, 36,000 is the per capita income. So per person, take the income of the nation divided by the population, you've got per capita income. This is pretty dramatic, right? 6,000 in income versus 36,000. Well, you might say, oh, well, things are cheaper over in Africa. No, this has all been adjusted for what economists call purchasing power parity and exchange rates, and all of that has been kind of equalized. So this is like a real purchasing power of $6,000. So like what you guys can buy at Walmart for $6,000, that's what we're talking about maybe some of those places in Africa can buy for $6,000. Meanwhile, in our country, we can buy 36,000, 6 times more than what they can, right? So there's this trend here on as freedom is increased, we've got this nice result on income. How many of you would like to live a while? So 14 years. 14 years. I see a lot of people in here that might be a little under 20, a little over 20. Is 14 years a good chunk? Yeah. Life expectancy. Countries that adopt more free policies tend to live longer. That's a big, big deal. Infant mortality rates. How are our babies doing? This is deaths of 40 babies per 1,000 births. Least free, most free. We're talking about living longer. We're talking about babies going on to becoming adults. This is getting serious. This isn't just about money. There's a lot more at stake. How is the poverty doing? This graph kind of looks a little depressing at first. It looks like the poor will always be among us. Maybe you've heard something like that. So in all of the countries, the share of income tends to be about the same. So why is that important? Well, where do you want to live? Because 2% of 36,000 is a lot more than 2% of 6,000, right? So this is one that's kind of near and dear to my heart. I told you at the Gortney Institute, we especially look at poverty and poverty-related issues. So this is the poorest 10% of the country. So we're going to look at the poor of the poor and look at how much money they're getting. Where do you want to live if you're in the poorest 10%? Someplace like the United States or someplace over in Africa? This is a big difference. Remember, this data has already been corrected for purchasing power parity and everything. This is real money, real food, real clothing, real transportation that's being purchased. These guys have that much more, over 5 times more stuff than in the other countries. And you see the progression as it goes, as we move through with more freedom. Extreme poverty and moderate poverty. So 43% in the least free countries, 43%, $3.20 a day, as the UN defines it, for moderate poverty. Extreme poverty, $1.90 a day. $1.90 a day, and here's what we face in free countries, right? Big difference. Now, when I say $1.90 a day, that means the Starbucks that you guys bought on campus for $5.19, you just consumed 3 times the wages almost, right? 2.5 times the wages of somebody living in another country for the day. That's real. That's Starbucks, exactly that thing. So this stuff is important. Political rights and civil rights. So where do we see more democracy? We see it in the free countries. Where do women have more rights? We tend to see it in the more free countries. So here's the Gender Inequality Index. So if you're a woman, it's better to be in a relatively free country. In other lesser free countries, women don't have the same rights. This stuff is important, right? It touches on a lot of different areas. Okay, and then finally, happiness. How many people want to be happy? Live in a free country. If you don't live in a free country, or if you come from a country that's not so free, maybe we need to start working on getting them more free, because people, through self-reported happiness, so this is kind of a survey type of thing. How do you rank your happiness on a scale of 0 to 10? But self-reported happiness tends to be higher in people that have more, in countries where people have more freedom. All right, so we talked about the world. It's time to get down to the states. So that similar type of stuff is going on here in the states, at the state level, and then even down to the municipal levels. And so if we take all of the United States of America, North Carolina is 14th. Not too bad, not too bad. You're in the second quartile, right? There's 50 states, so 14th, not too bad. Here's the top 10. So I highlighted Tennessee, since it's a neighboring place here. So they're in 3rd place in the country in terms of how much economic freedom they have in that state. And Georgia's pretty nearby. They're at 6. Florida's been there, but they were first before. Now New Hampshire took over. And then, of course, the great state of Kansas there is in 10, which kind of surprised me. They actually moved up, so that's good. I wasn't sure with some of the moves that have been done over time whether that would happen. Least free. Again, I highlighted some, at least the close states, not necessarily neighboring. Kentucky, 43. West Virginia, right? And then places like New York and California, you're going to find less economic freedom when you go to those states. If you work in those states, there's going to be a larger chunk of your paycheck that's coming out, maybe some more regulations, different types of wage restrictions, all that kind of stuff can vary from state to state. Now, part of me thinks this is really what makes America great, though, right? Because if you don't like the state you live in, what can you do? Move. Do you need permission from the governor of the next state over? No, we got free mobility. That's part of why we rank high as the United States. Mobility of resources is important. And so we can do what famous economist Thibault came up with, vote with our feet. We don't like where we live, we can vote with our feet and move. And so that's exactly what we see happening, is some mobility across places. Here's the subcategories. I'm not going to go into gory details with you here, but just to give you a sense, I went and put North Carolina, since part of this talk was about where do you guys rank to the rest of the world. In government spending, you're 23rd. Okay, so in the top half anyway for government spending. So government consumption expenditures as a percentage of income. So if I take all the incomes in North Carolina and I say, well, how much money is the government spending based on that? Meaning that the government needs taxes to get that money, right? So it kind of goes in line. How much does government take off? They're in 25th. 38th, though, in transfers and subsidies. So what do we mean by that? Welfare payments, grants, corporate welfare, right? You guys know what corporate welfare is? Big business plays kissy face with some congressman, and then they're like, oh yeah, well what if we bring this new deal? Oh yeah, we can probably sport you $1 million worth of tax credits or something for that, right? So basically subsidies of companies in some way, shape, or form, that's trying to be captured here too. And then insurance and retirement payments. So North Carolina's pretty strong in that. So those areas combined, giving the overall rank. Taxes, 35th. Not so hot. Falling a little bit down, relative to other states anyway. So income and payroll tax revenue as a percentage of income. Remember, this is state income tax, right? Because we're looking at the state level. We all got to pay the federal government whatever we got to pay. So this is kind of narrowing it down to that. Marginal income tax rates. So that's if you have a higher top rate. So you're taxing the rich, which sounds good. Tax the rich, give it to the poor, a little Robin Hood theory or something. So this is trying to capture part of that. Again, when we look at a marginal rate, it's not the total tax rate. So if I'm making $100,000 a year and I fall into the 40% tax bracket and I make an extra 1,000, that extra 1,000 is what gets taxed the 40%, right? So the brackets kind of go up. The more that you make, the more they take, is our progressive tax system that we have. So that's what that's capturing. Property taxes, North Carolina's 11th, not too bad on property taxes. That usually goes to fund more local things in a community. And then sales tax, 24th. There's some states that have zero income tax and all sales tax. And so one of my students just the other day when I was going through this stuff said, oh, what's their tax rate at the cash register? I'm like, gosh, in Kansas it's about 10%, a little short of 10%. And I'm like, oh, that's about 10%. Really? How does that happen? How can they not have an income tax and still have enough money? Well, people change their behaviors. Maybe the government limits some spending, and it's a complicated mess, but it's possible. Other states have shown that that's a possible path. So there's about, I can't remember, 10 to 13 states. Tennessee is one of them. Florida, Texas, that do not have income tax at the state level. And then labor market. So minimum wage, 19th. Is there a minimum wage in North Carolina? I didn't do a bunch of specific research in North Carolina. Is it higher than the federal? Is it the federal? Okay, so it's at the federal level. So that kind of falls in line with other places. So some places you may have heard of moving for a $15 minimum wage, which sounds great, but they tend to have more unemployment there, right? Especially among high schoolers. But that's what really kind of hurts me. I think about my high school job. Do you guys like your high school job? Had fun at your high school job, maybe? Or just kind of, we used to go out and party and stuff after, and it was just, you kind of build friendships that you wouldn't otherwise build. A lot of kids are missing out on that in Seattle and some other places where $15 minimum wage, because as soon as that goes up, the employer has incentive now to only keep who they need to keep and not hire everybody that they possibly could. So that's an issue that is faced with minimum wage. So government employment as a percentage, 37. What's the name of that fort? About an hour away or so? Fort Bragg. I suspect that that's causing a large portion of that. So government employment as a percentage of the total employment in a given state. So how many jobs are kind of government jobs? And I suspect part of that might be due to that. So North Carolina is down. So by the way, none of these necessarily say it's bad. So when you see a low ranking, it might be for a very good reason, like the Army base or something, right? So it might be there. So when we look at this overall, you kind of have to take a holistic picture and kind of see, well, is that really a problem or not in some of these different areas? So union density, so how much of the employment is kind of union-based. Sometimes there's additional restrictions on employees, so that kind of can lower your freedom. Of course, unions can be a trade-off too. You get a higher paycheck, but maybe you don't have as much freedom in other areas. But again, what we see in union states is that there's somebody who didn't get that union job, right? And so it might be more difficult to get a job at that place, and so there can be some unemployment issues there. Okay, not expecting to digest this, but it's kind of to expose you to the depth of this data overall. I picked the bordering states here, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. And so North Carolina is the red line, and up top is the overall score. The main reason I put this up here is to just show how things change over time. Who's in the state legislature? What's the culture of North Carolina? What are some things going on? So they were more bunched up back in the 80s, and then maybe some changes in policy. This is South Carolina on the bottom, and things can change over time. And it usually takes a while for those things to happen, but change can occur. Taxes and labor, again, kind of a quick snapshot. Tennessee is up at the top there in the tax department, and that's partly due to that sales tax, the no income tax. So that's going to raise your score in that category. All right, so why do we care about state level stuff? Well, similar to what we saw on the country level data, you make more money in more free states. So more economic freedom within a state can lead to higher income levels as well. All right, so this is kind of a fun map. So it is looking at metropolitan service areas. So if you see the MSA, metropolitan service areas are the areas of municipalities that kind of make up an economy. And so there might be a couple large cities, even if they cross state boundaries. So in Kansas City, we have Kansas City, Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri, and you guys kind of have some similar things going on there in Virginia. So that is a metropolitan service area. There's 52 of these things which have 1 million people or more. Here's where you guys rank. I pulled out a couple related to North Carolina, not so much the Atlanta one, but 13 and 15 for Raleigh. And then Charlotte is down there a little bit further at 30 out of the 52 of places over 1 million. So here's North Carolina only. So I took all of the municipalities, these MSAs, I flew into Fayetteville, and their ranking is 164th out of 330 of these MSAs. That's Fayetteville. And Rocky Mount, anybody from Rocky Mount? Sounds like they got some heavy government or something there. They're at 268. So the point to kind of bringing this up is that it again shows how governments can align themselves, and maybe it's due to the people who live there through Democratic vote or otherwise, and they can have different policies, some that favor more freedom, some that don't have as much freedom. And even within the state of North Carolina, there can be some pretty big differences. And again, I think this is one of the powerful things of federalism, is kind of the fancy word, is that in the United States, constitutionally, the idea was to keep the national government real limited, right? Small, limited federal government so that orders can't be barked down from Trump or Obama or whoever's in office, doesn't like rock our boat too much. And so then we work down to the states. The states are more empowered to do things. And that's what we saw in those graphs. And then furthermore, the municipalities have the option to change some laws and make and choose how they want to spend tax dollars. And so that's this idea of federalism, and I think it's one of the beautiful things of the United States of America is we don't want a one-size-fits-all across. I think this is something that's not really appreciated as much as it should be, the fact that we can pack our bags and go to a different state, we can go to a different city, right? So we can kind of vote with our feet. That mobility is something that other countries don't have, and that's because of the way we organize things. Here is the top 10 and the bottom 10 for the large MSAs. So it's all Cities that you're probably familiar with, at least American students here, Houston, Jacksonville, Dallas, San Antonio, Buffalo, New York, Los Angeles, right? And so that's the 52, top 10, bottom 10. And the reason I put that up there is to kind of show this pic. Off to the left is 1970, Detroit and Houston. Notice the populations are kind of similar, 1.5 million, 1.2. Cleveland, Dallas, St. Louis, San Antonio, Pittsburgh, Phoenix, Buffalo, Jacksonville. The idea here is they were all about the similar size population. Fast forward to 2016 and look at the population change. We're seeing that TIMO analysis of people voting with their feet. Economic freedom matters. Off to the right here is their ranking on where they were for their municipality. And more free cities have seen a lot more growth. And so it is important, even at the local level, to be thinking about the policies we have. And are we planning for competition, or are we planning to keep competition out, right? Kind of the protectionist type of thought. Are we planning for competition? And that's how we want to kind of set up our community, a very entrepreneurial spirit. Or are we planning to protect and insulate ourselves from the rest of the world or from other communities? Here, this information is kind of compelling on the growth or shrinkage that the city might face based on their freedom. Okay, so per capita income. This is in those MSAs. Do you see a theme here, right? So this is income, most free, least free, compared to the average. So we see that same thing coming up, that these policies are good policies if we care about some of the things that we've been showing. All right, so here is our population growth, most free to least free. I know population growth is something that, talking to Thomas about Pembroke here, is important, right? So would we like to see more population in Pembroke? Would that help restaurants, entrepreneurs, getting a bigger density? Well, these are the types of policies where you have the best shot at getting more of that. There's other factors, of course, but that is an important factor. Studies have been done on income. So we might have physical human beings leaving the state, like that other chart showed, but they also look at migration of income. And so states that have more freedom tend to be growing in income. States with less, New York and California, tend to have these migration patterns, not only of people, but of income. And so who's leaving the state? Well, it could tend to be the higher income people that are getting hit with that higher tax rate, and they have the ability to move, and so they do. All right, so I thought I'd throw this quote up here on kind of some of the founding principles. And the neat thing that Jim Gortney and some others did, he worked with Milton Friedman on this project, by the way, was to try to say, how do we measure that? How can we see if we're getting these things of what we think are important? Or should we move more towards some sort of communal sharing? Is it better for the government to increase its size? Or is it better left in the hands of individuals? A famous economist, Friedrich Hayek, thought that the government cannot get enough information to make the right decision. There is information, as mundane as it might seem, that's in your head, and your head, and your head. And you can't quite convey that information, like trying to explain, well, you say you love your wife, explain that. I mean, what's your love? Well, I don't know, I just love her, right? So we have this information that's embodied in us that can't be extracted by the government to make better decisions. And so what we were founded on was to say, let's let people make those decisions. It's actually a way to harness knowledge by allowing people freedom to do what they think is best in the pursuit of their own happiness. All right, so to close up before we get to some questions here, what are the recommendations that we get out of this then? I call it the secret sauce for poverty fighting and other things. So reduce spending of government not a reduce person. I believe in social safety nets, by the way. That's not the point. But if you're showing up in these rankings at the higher levels and you're seeing the outcomes that we're doing, we might ought to look at reducing spending. The weak thing that leaders do sometimes is say, oh, well, we got to cut spending by 10% across the board. Well, that's a dumb thing, right? In terms of having the strength to say, this is where we have our comparative advantage. It's in coconuts, not in fish. So maybe we should leave coconuts alone and cut fish a bunch more, right? So figuring out where is government efficient, where is it not efficient, where does it have an advantage, where does it not have an advantage, and look for those opportunities. Seeking private solutions. So is there charter schools in North Carolina? You guys have a charter system here? So not every state has that. I think that's a fabulous example of looking for market solutions. And sometimes the pushback I'll get is like, oh, Russ, but there was this charter school and they did awful in their exam scores. And I'm like, great. That's exactly how the system's supposed to work. Because if you've got a public system controlled by the government and they have awful scores, they just continue to kind of have awful scores for a while. They cry for more money, they get more money, right? There's no correction mechanism. With the charter system, if you're not getting good scores, do people send their kids to that school? No. The school goes under. That might take a little bit to happen, but that's a good thing. Because we don't have that same correction mechanism when we have a monopoly of the government running K through 12 education. There's no competition. And so having some sort of system where we're not completely turning, things over to the private sector, but rather thinking about some nudges to market principles to see if we can get some better outcomes. And in large part, in many areas, the charter schools have done really well, usually on a more limited budget than what the public schools have done. So that's just something that a direction you can think ahead. Tollways is another way of having people pay. Oh, my road has always been free. I know it's always been free, but it didn't have to be free, right? And in fact, if we charge you, you might pick a different route. The busy person who really needs to get from point A to point B, oh yeah, $5 for the toll? I'd actually pay $10, but I'll pay $5, right? So that's again using market principles to try to solve problems rather than having the governments come in and say, we need more roads. Maybe we don't need more roads. Maybe we have enough roads. We just need to give incentive for people to use other roads on different cases. Yes, it might be 10 minutes longer, but that might not be a big deal for you. It might be worth it to avoid the toll, right? Those are market-based principles of allowing people to make different choices by introducing some sort of pricing system into the setup. Lower taxes, especially income taxes. So economists have long touted this idea of a consumption tax. There's a movement you guys might have heard about called the fair tax. It's not the flat tax, but I won't go into details, but maybe the whole United States should be on a sales tax, and we just eliminate income tax. Now that's a far-fetched idea. Oh, I got a clap. All right, I got the single clap. Right? Oh, all right. So that dropped the mic moment. Okay, so that might be a way to get people saving more, right? And a lot of efficiencies that can come in with moving towards a sales tax. But even at the state level, that's been an attractive way for many states to move. Reducing regulatory burden. So what are the things in place? Maybe you've heard about hair braiders. People who braid hair. Anybody, ladies hair, guys get their hair braided, go to a professional, pay some money? Okay, I see a few hands coming up. So there was a big move that they had to be licensed to do that. Really? To braid hair. Okay, well, maybe there's something there. But guess who pushed getting licensed? Who's the one that came up with this licensing concept? The hair salons and the tanning salons and other places that wanted to protect their business. So do we have a government that says, you're right, we got to increase safety of braiding, and it's really a small faction of existing producers that are looking for protection, right? Because if they force the hair braiders to have some sort of $120 permit fee and an annual inspection of some sort, that might be enough for somebody not to work out of their house braiding hair. And so do we have a government that says, you can go open up a lemonade stand if you want? Just go up and do it? Or do we have a government that has the police come out and try to arrest the 10-year-old for the lemonade stand, right? So how many regulations do we have that might infringe on our economic freedom? That's something to look at. I was going to say one more thing, but we better get to questions here. So private solutions, professional organizations, a lot of times organizations can self-police themselves. And I know that sounds bad maybe, but it actually can be very effective. In fact, in developing countries where you have microfinance loans, they'll finance it. Usually tended to be small business women, and let's say 5 of them get a loan. If one doesn't pay, the others don't get their funding, right? So they have this kind of social pressure that is a way to enforce the contract that might not otherwise be able to be offered. And so again, looking for private solutions on how companies might be able to do that themselves and eliminate some of the burden. We say, oh, the government's got to step in and watch those people. But time and time again, the government doesn't catch it. The Wells Fargo thing. The government was there, they regulate that, and Wells Fargo still did all of that, right? So there's a lot of circumstances where the government didn't do their job of what they said they were going to do. But of course the answer is, if something bad happens in the private sector, we need more government. No, the government was already there watching the house, the hen house, but they didn't do their job. And so that's something that should be considered with today's technology, the self-policing, all the stuff that we can do. There's lots of, the government tends to not take advantage of these new technologies. I think there's a lot of ways that government could get more efficient, and some governments have done that. Okay, well that is the talk here. This is where you can get more information on the website about Free the World, and we got some time here to open up for some questions. Before I forget to say too, I've got some stickers for my Faith and Economics podcast, and then some cards up here. If you guys want to contact me at another time or get that information, I'd be happy to do it.
Thank you, Dr. McCullough. At this time, Dr. Menzel will walk around with the microphone if anyone has a question that they would like to ask Dr. McCullough. They're all being shot.
The pregnant pause is what my colleague calls it. So we just have to wait. So did it get hot here, or is it just me?
So Russ, really great talk, thanks.
Thank you.
So, yeah, as we talked earlier, this area is historically depressed, actually, historically distressed and depressed. Is there something that you see in rural areas that historically not pulling themselves out of poverty, some lever you can pull quickly to get things moving?
You're not going to like my answer. The cities that have been able to do something have had to reinvent themselves in a big way. And these are big cities, like Pittsburgh. Once steel went away, and then they turned into a little innovation center. For the rural towns, the density is just difficult to get a critical mass to where things are going to be the way they're going to be. And so the answer that I'm going to give that you're not going to like is that it might be more of an acceptance thing of needing to figure out, I might need to move. That's a tough thing. This is my home. I've been here for 30 years. This is where my family is. I think a lot of people end up making that switch and finding new opportunities that they never would have. I think communities, we mentioned this, or I mentioned this earlier, and I'm not an expert in it, but coming up with ways to shrink smartly. So there's some economists that study rural towns on, is there resources that can be devoted so that we're not build it and they will come type of thing, spending maybe some tax dollars thinking that a new industrial park or something is going to be kind of the savior as a new manufacturing plant comes into town or something. Is there ways we can think to say, it's a little bit of an acceptance thing, but to say, I like our community, I like my family. Are there things we can do that will allow us to stay where we're at? And kind of think about resources differently than just growth. How do we get the population growing? Oh, we got to make babies, and oh, but if we make more babies, then they just seem to leave because there's more opportunities in the big city, right? And so you're in this cycle of denial is what I see a lot of rural towns in. And so it's not an easy thing, but I think some sort of acceptance that we might have to make some changes. And that's not an easy pill to swallow, so I'm not, that's not very popular news for the smaller towns. But a great question and a great struggle, and I do empathize, again, with the poverty stuff that I do in developing countries and other places. A lot of people look at the people in the urban area that are all the people asking for money and the poverty in the city. And an economist, Ed Glazer, one of my favorites from Harvard, said that's actually a healthy sign that a city's doing well. If you're attracting poor people to your town, that's actually a sign of prosperity, not that you're doing something wrong necessarily. It could be if you have a number of entitlement programs or something, maybe there's something else going wrong there. But in theory, the attraction of the poor to the city is that move that we're talking about, and kind of that sort of acceptance that maybe I can't stay where I'm at.
Question here?
Yes, so I was interested in hearing your thoughts about where this idea of economic freedom and faith intersect.
Okay, great.
And that's probably maybe off topic.
No, I love that topic. So I would, first of all, say check out our podcast on faith and economics, because we explore a lot of that. So I am not a theologian by any stretch. I'm a Missouri Synod Lutheran, so I like Luther's thoughts on a lot of things. But I do the podcast with a card-carrying Catholic. He was raised Protestant, I was raised Catholic, and then we kind of switched. So we have a bunch of interesting discussions about freedom. I guess without getting into a big detailed discussion is that I think these freedom ideas are biblically supported. I think it's your relationship with Christ that is the important one, and you need the freedom to be able to establish that relationship rather than it being something that is contrived or forced upon you. And so I think a lot of the things of us living our lives and figuring out this and working through sin and problems that we have is part of us getting closer to finding grace.
I have a question concerning minimum wage.
Yeah.
And for instance, I know that some department stores are raising minimum wage to like $15 at a flat rate. So that's your supervisors, sales associates. Do you think that would decrease employee morale? Because therefore now, if you're a supervisor, you're making the same as a sales associate. Do you think that would drive people to fly away?
No, great question, great question. The answer is no. I'm all for Costco comes to mind, and Hobby Lobby, I think maybe, and some other places where we pay our, in fact, Walmart just recently came out with some of this too. We are paying $15 an hour. So that is great when an individual company wide decides to employ a minimum wage. Whether that's going to work or not is going to be market dependent, right? And so they will get a bunch of people, and hopefully some high quality people, and it'll work for them. But it's not stated across the board. And so that is a market response. Walmart probably won't tell you this, but they believe it's profitable to pay their workers $15 an hour. I guarantee you, right? I'm going to have happier workers. Workers are more productive. There's a rich body of research that shows, that compensating them well is one ingredient. It's not everything, but is one way to get and keep good workers that will be more productive and want to come to work and with a smile on their face. And so it'll be a profitable move for them to do it. If they didn't, then their costs are going to go up, their shares are going to go down. It just starts to have this effect where they might not be able to compete with Target and other places. But otherwise, yeah, I'm all for that. That's a market response. Anytime you have one thing that I don't, well, maybe I did, who knows? Sometimes I lose track of what I say during these things. So, the voluntary nature of the market system. So when two parties say, I want to hire you and you want to work for me, and you're not forced to work there, you can go leave and go somewhere else. that is a win-win situation. When the government comes in, they do it by force. There's no choice. You can go to jail for not paying your taxes, right? Is that true? So truly, it's a coercive system when the government makes those choices for us. So when the government employs $15 across the board, all companies have to do that, and that's limiting your choice and then causing unemployment. So it's this voluntary versus non-voluntary that I really hang my hat on the market system to say, well, those people aren't making enough money, and well, couldn't they move somewhere else? Couldn't they move to the bigger city, perhaps? Again, it might not be an answer that they like, but is there mobility to do it? They might think that they're forced into that job, but this is the United States of America. God bless America. You're not forced into that job. It's really a market transaction, and it should be a win-win situation. If your employer is eventually creating a losing situation for you, you're out of there, right? And go find another job. And that's the mobility that we need in a market system of more and more voluntary choices. Okay, yeah.
Okay, so is like the concept of getting rid of like the income tax as opposed, and then like essentially raising the sales tax because you're getting rid of the income tax, right? Is that concept is it because in terms of like economic freedom and everything, is it because now the only way you would get taxed is if you go buy something?
Correct.
Instead of like, even if you didn't spend it, you still get taxed off of it. Is that?
If you don't spend it, you'll save it. And so it tends to increase savings. And kind of I'll just touch on this. When you save money, it enters the financial system, right? And then there's another entrepreneur that wants to start a business that's all gung-ho, that thinks there's going to be a 30% return. And so the banker lends your money to that business. And so they act as an intermediary of getting money into the hands of the most productive people. When I talk about knowledge being in those skulls, if we have a good credit market system where those entrepreneurs have opportunities to exploit the profit opportunity that they think exists, now we have incentives in place where more people are going to tend to save more money rather than spend as much. At the margin, right? So let's say Americans consume 90% on average and 10%. We changed the law to a sales tax, and by the way, it was 23% at the cash register. So you go to Walmart, spend $100, you cut them a check for $123 for just the federal, and then if you have state tax on top of that, it would be a little higher. Now that sounds scary, but when you put 10 hours in at your job and you make $10 an hour and you end up earning $100 and your employer hands you your paycheck, guess how much is on the paycheck? $100, right? So that system, by the way, is revenue neutral. What's proposed is revenue neutral, that we're going to set the sales tax at a rate which they believe estimated to be 23%. That would completely eliminate all the income taxes. And so the government's still collecting the same amount of money, it's just how they're collecting it. And this again gives incentives to save. If people don't have to pay income tax, is that going to induce more people to go to work? Yeah, you're effectively going from a $60 paycheck to a $100 paycheck, right? So you're getting the income, so it incentivizes people to work. So you got the incentive to work, the incentive to save. That's two of the huge things with that type of system of how it changes the incentives.
I had a question with inflation. I know you mentioned that everyone's getting their increase in paychecks and stuff like that. We also came across this problem a bunch of years ago when Obama was thinking about increasing the amount, but that would also cause our inflation to come back up and the value of our dollar to drop at some point as well. So would we just be facing that same issue again, or how would we get out of that cycle?
Yeah, no, there'd be a balance. That's kind of a detailed, there's a detailed question. First of all, long term, the inflation rate is controlled by the central bank in terms of how much money they're creating. Obama and Trump are not the boss of the Federal Reserve, the central bank. So there's complete independence between them. And so the supply of money is controlled by them, which then in turn, long term, leads to controlling the inflation. And so our government's been pretty responsible over time to keep the inflation rate at 2 to 3%, and that's why we're still one of the world's currency, essentially. And it's because of how responsible we've been with that. So there might be some short-term fluctuations in prices or something, but nothing that would be overly inflationary from it per se.
Thank you. One thing I didn't mention, which is what you want to hear the most, we have food and refreshments afterwards. Dr. McCullough, we'd like to thank you again for coming here and speaking with us today.
Thank you. It's been great. Oh wait, I want to get a selfie here of the group. So let me get this going here. Let's see. I'm kind of old. I don't. Okay.